It wasn't all that long ago, a week and a half or so. Calhoun County Commissioner Steve Frisbie and Gary Tompkins were, this makes it sound maybe differently than it was, summoned to the White House. They went with a bunch of other county commissioners from across the country. And what that was all about is the subject of our discussion here today as Steve Frisbie and Gary Tompkins are with us this morning. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Summoned makes it sound like it was the principal's office calling. Right? Yeah. It wasn't that way, right?
Yeah. And the folks weren't from across the country. They were from Michigan specific.
Only Michigan?
Yep. We were the third state invited to the White House.
I see.
Florida and Pennsylvania. And it's every county commissioner in Michigan and the other states that have been already. Every county commissioner, regardless of party, and tribal leaders were all invited to the White House to see what's going on.
Okay, so eventually everybody goes, but they go in groups.
Yeah, I think there was about 80 of us, close to it.
That's right.
Yeah, so 2 per county. Is that the way it shook out?
Well, no, not every county was. Berrien had 6 folks. Kalamazoo had 2.
Okay.
We had 2. Berry County, there was 1. There was quite a few counties not represented at all. Oakland, they were there. I think Washtenaw, several counties, but not all of the 83 counties were able to make it.
So as you were lining up to go, what was the notion for what you would expect to see and do?
Well, one of the goals of the conference that was stated to us was to ensure that we were introduced and put into contact with federal agencies and contacts directly to strengthen the relationship with local government. And, in many cases, that's a very fair assessment as, in many cases, the residents, our constituents, essentially, when they're asking questions, we're that frontline contact.
Right.
So the ability to us to have links directly to federal government is a very positive thing.
Yeah. But, really going in, we didn't know.
Yeah.
We had no agenda. But when you're summoned to the White House, like you said, invited by the White House to come talk, and it's an entire group, Gary and I felt, and others couldn't make it. It was short notice, too. It was about a 2-week notice.
Oh, my. Right.
So we felt it was important enough. We were able to clear our schedules and get off to Washington, D.C. And by the way, Gary and I paid our own way back and forth and for our meals and everything that was incorporated into this. So we don't want taxpayers to think that, we jaunted off to Washington, D.C. on their dime.
Yeah, and I will comment real quickly, if I may.
Yeah.
When we first got the email from Billy Kirkland, I must say I conferred with Commissioner Frisbie as to was this a reality or was this something else? So, no question.
And we have a joint friend out of our MPLP that I spoke about last time.
Yeah.
I called him. He works in Washington. He said, yep, this is legit. Right. And
we are told to question our emails, right?
Right.
That's correct.
It's like,
that's correct.
Yeah, why would they want to talk to county commissioners? Because they've never done that before.
Well, I was about to ask that. Have you heard about anything like this happening before? It hasn't, has it?
No, I will say Shelley Taub, who is a Oakland County commissioner, has been for 24 years. She indicated the night before at our NACO briefing, if you will, that in her 24 years, this is nothing that's ever happened of this.
That is really interesting.
Yeah. So what the goal was to take the Office of Intergovernmental Relations, and all it's been before is we'll tell you what you need to know, when you need to know, and how you need to know it, and don't worry about anything else.
Sure.
Keep the mushrooms, right?
Yep.
So their entire goal of this process is to take that Intergovernmental Relations Department and flip it around, and they want to be the kind of the catch-all is the best way to say it of. And they gave us examples of things that they've fixed already that are just government red tape that make the normal citizen go, why is that way?
Yep.
For instance, tribal land in Oklahoma, their reservation was right on a state border, and I don't remember which one. They received federal funds for Meals on Wheels for their seniors. Several of their seniors lived half a mile off the reservation in another state.
Right.
Legally, they couldn't feed them. That's crazy.
Yeah.
For 2 years, they asked for a waiver from the previous administration, never heard back, got the runaround, a lot of red tape, bureaucratic nonsense. Within 2 weeks after the president was elected and installed his political appointees in that office, and I think it was the Department of Interior that dealt with the Bureau of Land Management and all that for the Indians reservations, they said, yeah, go ahead and feed them, and we'll get the waiver. And they did it in 2 weeks.
So did you go with ideas for what you thought you needed to talk about that the feds needed to hear about Calhoun County?
Well, after we got to meet 3 cabinet members, including Billy Kirkland, who runs this office. We met Secretary DeVos from the Department of Education and the administrator of the Small Business Administration, Linda McMahon. And after each one of those presentations, we were offered the opportunity to talk and ask questions, more of a one-on-one conversation. And multiple commissioners had great questions about, and they could direct us. They were starting to direct us already. So we met with 15 different departments while we were there. And the information that we got in how government has not functioned well for the past many, many years, and the intent to turn that around through a bureaucratic mess into a smooth-running organization, that's hard to do in a government that's in the federal government.
Yep.
But that's truly what we got to do, is point out some of the shortfalls of, did you know, or, hey, we have this question. So,
well, and I think kudos certainly to Billy Kirkland, who is the Deputy Director of Intergovernmental Affairs, as well as Justin Clark, who is his direct report, in terms of thinking out of the box and willing to bring us to the White House, essentially, and to be willing to listen. And certainly they weren't going to get all positives. There were several very tough questions that were asked amongst many of the commissioners. So, again, kudos to them for willing to take that leap. And, you know, going forward, this is not just a one-of-a-time thing. This is there's also a bi-monthly conference, or a bi-monthly conference call that will be arranged, in which there will be conversations from the White House and with federal agencies, in addition to us being able to ask questions and feedback. So this is an ongoing thing. This isn't just a one-time, let's listen to our ideas, here's our contact information, thank you. This is an ongoing process moving forward. So,
boy, that's got to be a full-time job for at least one person, just sorting through the responses they're going to get from across the country and trying to funnel them in the right direction.
So when we can take a village manager or a city manager or a county administrator, department heads, and say, hey, you know, we've got this conference call coming up. Do you want to join us, number one, to help best explain this issue? And get input back of how you can solve it, or, as they said, the second most powerful word in the English language is no. But if you get the no, you at least know you're done, right? So, and you can move on and do something different. So, Gary and I really haven't planned this out yet, but that was my thought process of, there's a lot of leaders. And if you're a citizen with a federal government issue, if it's something that we could bring forward, just contact us, and we can, in this process in the future, bring it forward if it's something that we think we could help address.
What are some of the examples of what you heard from commissioners, or your examples yourself, that were being brought up in this forum? When somebody says, tell us what's going on, particularly in a situation where that hasn't necessarily happened before, what were you hearing?
We were surprised, I think, at the depth and the breadth of every one of these departments. For instance, the Department of Commerce, or, excuse me, the Department of State. I thought, well, what are we going to hear about as county commissioners? We don't deal with foreign nations. But we talked about trade a little bit. But then they started explaining all the opportunities that exist for high schools to partner with them, to learn about government and learn about foreign affairs. And there's plenty of opportunity there. So I think that was the big surprise for me, is how much of a breadth they have in depth of their organization.
Yeah, well, you take into consideration NASA was a presenter, and when all of us are looking at each other collectively going, how does NASA affect Michigan? And really there's many ways in which NASA does, in fact, affect Michigan, through funding to schools, as well as corporations within that are major funders to companies in Michigan. So
I just looked at my note. There's $46 million a year spent in Michigan by NASA.
Yeah.
Wow.
Some of it in STEM training to assist them to help identify future astronauts and engineers and those kind of folks. So when you stop and think about the impact of that, of how can we then take that and bring that back to our community, make those links, and make government work like it's supposed to, that's where it really gets exciting.
We're here with Commissioners Gary Tompkins and Steve Frisbie from Calhoun County, who visited the White House recently on the invitation of the Trump administration as they attempt to try and pick up on things from folks who have their ears to the ground. At some of the departments with which you had contact on this particular day would seem to make sense. The EPA, Housing and Human Services, FEMA, and the USDA, and places like that. But the VA and the Department of Transportation were represented, and Department of Commerce, as you mentioned, Department of Energy. So you had a lot of tentacles there that were picking up information. Did you get a sense then that there was an action plan for some of the things that were brought up and how you might hear back?
Yeah. For instance, we got to meet with Anthony Bedell from the Department of Transportation. Well, earlier in this year, we approved a grant at the county level, along with the city of Battle Creek, for a transit study countywide. Part of my issue has been federal dollars don't have strings attached to, when you're talking mass transportation. They have chains, and so you have to be careful of which way you move and what you accept and what it allows you to do and doesn't do. And there's not a lot of mobility within those programs. So as we move forward, we can say, hey, your rules and regulations really fit for a highly urbanized area, but they don't necessarily fit in a county where we're trying to move workers. And how do we partner private and federal dollars and make them work as they're intended to get people to jobs and to other things that they need to do. But so relaxing some of those regulations may be how we can say, hey, this would work for Calhoun County if you let us do this, and we think it's the wisest use of dollars. Would you help us with that?
And the response was favorable.
Absolutely, and I think one of the comments that Secretary Bedell stated was regarding regulatory reform and actually streamlining the processes to eliminate a lot of the red tape and the amount of time it takes. Also, one of the things he talks about was public-private partnerships being a major factor going forward with funding in Department of Transportation. So we're going to be watching this one very closely and have the ability that now that transportation is something that's on the many minds here in Calhoun County that we've got a direct link or a contact that we can follow through with.
So those conference calls going forward, do you participate in those?
Well, I can tell you, I personally emailed Mr. Kirkland, Billy Kirkland, and told him that I want to participate because I think it's essential, certainly for all of us, all our residents in Calhoun County, to have that voice. So I'm sure Commissioner Frisbie will be joining along with me in that pursuit.
Yeah, and the good thing is because we have regular jobs as well, we get to think in different terms too. So like talking with FEMA and disaster response and some of the hiccups there, and frankly some of the hard things they're facing right now in surge capacity. So yeah, I think that it'll be exciting to be able to have that link to say, here's what's going on in America that's driving people crazy.
Right.
When you hear people say government, there's no common sense in government. I don't think we would argue that at the federal level and sometimes even at the state level. So there's a way to bring common sense back. For instance, like that Oklahoma, reservation and Meals on Wheels I talked about.
Right.
They're all for it. They want to reduce red tape. They want to make sure that government functions the way it's supposed to, and that's serve people. That's what they want to do. They want programs to work, and if they don't work, they want to get rid of them. So I'll tell you who's nervous in Washington, D.C., and some conversations with some of these folks offline is the bureaucrats.
Oh, sure. Right.
They're being looked at very hard. They know that their jobs are on the line, and if they haven't been producing, and those folks make a lot of money. I'm talking $120,000 to $150,000 a year. Those folks are on the line, and they're going to be the ones that help lower the cost of government when they get rid of a lot of those bureaucrats that do nothing and create more red tape. I've always said bureaucracy begets more bureaucracy. They protect themselves, and instead of common sense, they come up with more crazy rules. So I think that was my takeaway is not only the conference, but then in talking with some of these political appointees offline of what's really going on and how they want to change. It was a phenomenal experience for me.
You agree with that, Gary?
Yeah, likewise, absolutely. Just the fact that we were willing to engage with them, and they were the ones taking the first step in the process, as opposed to us reaching out to them. They were reaching out to us, and it was very refreshing in a world full of negative, certainly negative media relative to government. It was just very refreshing to go and get a perspective where they were certainly putting forth their priorities and allowing us to engage with them firsthand. So,
and by the way, the president was not there.
No, he wasn't.
He was not.
He'd started his vacation already.
We did get to tour. We did the public tour like everybody does in the East Wing. That was...
Oh, it was phenomenal. Absolutely, no question.
Yeah. Well, it'll be interesting to see going forward what the responses are in these calls, and if you're able to see some differences from things that you've brought up and how this shakes out later.
Yeah. Gary and I are both pretty good at being on Facebook to spread that social media.
Yep.
So pay attention to those pages coming up, and they're a good way to contact us as well. So our contact information is out there. Don't be afraid to contact us if you have some real issues. You know, we're not the only ones. There's a guy named Bob Wills here in town. He was in Washington, D.C. in April or May, representing the Small Business Association of his trade, which is auto repair.
Yeah.
And they said his group said, hey, go to the White House. They're going to be talking about tax reform. So we're not the only ones from Calhoun County who've been to the White House talking reality. Citizens like Bob have been there saying, we want give you our input of what works and what doesn't work and how we can make it better. So it's awesome.
All right. Well, we appreciate your letting us know about it, and we'll check in the future and see how how this has played out.
Thank you.
You bet. Thank you.
Commissioners Gary Tompkins and Steve Frisbie